Okay, hi guys. So, April question time. So without further ado, we've got some great questions again. Let's get into them. So, first question from Noah. With rehabbing back injuries, is there an acceptable level of pain that is okay when training to build a resilient spine, like with core stability or glute work, or is a general principle to always stand at the pain tipping point when introducing new movements to the rehabbing back patient? Okay, so the general idea, the short answer is that we want to avoid aggravation in the back. So obviously what we're trying to do is, if someone's got a back injury, we're trying to help it and work in ways to let it get better, not provoke it. So if we're feeling the back getting aggravated, that generally means there's a technique breakdown somewhere. So that could be for a couple of reasons. One, could just be that it's not the right time for that person to do that exercise. Could be it's just the wrong exercise for that person to do. Or it could be if we manage to get a few reps or a few sets and then it starts to get a bit suspicious, it could just be like fatigue and a technique breakdown from fatigue. But the ultimate goal is to avoid irritating the back. So as a general approach, if you want a good sort of rule of thumb, is that we need to approach rehab in a way that the person, their back is sore and irritated and in pain because it's already overused. What we're trying to do with rehab is bring other components up to scratch so that they do their fair share of the work. So when we're doing rehab exercises, we need to make sure that those components are doing that work and it's not just kind of, leaking out into the back and kind of exacerbating, ingraining the habit of already overusing the back. So we want to use the back less, not more. So obviously that's a bit of an interesting idea because most people think that if you've got a sore back, you've got a weak back. 9 times out of 10, it's more that you've got an overused back. And it's the other things that you don't feel connected to. That's the issue. So from a personal side, quite often people say that one of my sort of highest skill that I've got is exercise demonstration, particularly with people that are in acute pain with their spine. So if you're the sort of person where you sneeze and your back implodes, or you step off a curve and your back implodes, I'm generally good at getting those people to get the right components to switch on because, and this is my secret, this is my superpower, this is my gift of injury. When my back was bad 10 years ago, if I did even something as simple as like a McGill curl or just a level 1 side bridge, and I was a millimeter incorrect or imprecise with the movement, I would just get, a wall of pain and not be able to move for 20 minutes. So what that did, the benefit of that is it taught me very clearly the importance of being precise. So when we do rehab exercises, I'm not looking for 90, 95%, I'm looking for 100%. If we can't maintain that 100% as we go, then that's a fatigue issue. So we do as many reps as we can with perfect technique, that's what we're aiming for. Once it starts to deteriorate, that's the end of the set or the end of the exercise. So, when you're someone who's got or you've been in a severe back injury, and sometimes it's hard for clinicians and coaches and strength coaches and rehab coaches to understand, is that something that might seem like an easy normal movement to the average person, when you've got back pain, severe back pain, one little movement that's wrong is just going to catch you straight away and then you're going to be like that for 20 minutes as it sort of eventually calms down. So that's why when we do things like the McGill curl, we've really got to be 100% precise is the key. Any little mistakes we make are either going to exacerbate the existing problem or program in more technique errors as we go, which is what we don't want. So most important thing is to understand the technique first of all, and then hold yourself accountable to get it 100% right. If you can't get it 100% right, again, it's either not the right time for the exercise for you, it's the wrong exercise for you, or there's a fatigue issue. Now with the fatigue issue, we can work around things like Russian descending sets. So that's where maybe on the first set you can get 4 good reps and you start to get fatigued. So on the second set we might do 3, last set we might just do 2. So things like side bridges work really well and bird dogs work really well for that sort of approach because it keeps the work quality high. It stops us breaking through that fatigue point where things just start to deteriorate. We just start chewing the back up again. So again, the answer is, the goal that we're looking for is that people should feel better once they've done a rehab session, not that they should feel that their back's worse or aggravated or irritated or being chewed up. So that's always your goal with a rehab session, is make the back feel better, definitely not worse, because that means you've gone wrong somewhere. Okay, so Nice meaty question here from, it's either FR Eddie or it's just Freddie within the space. So he says, I used to be able to powerhouse loads of weight. Before my back injury, I could squat like 3 plates, whereas now I can barely get 10 kilos each side if I tried. If I tried picking something overhead, like my lower back will crumble, and when I walk, I feel like I don't have proper coordination. I have a spondylolisthesis, L5S1, at stage 1 slippage. Why is all this happening? Okay, so I don't get a lot of these, but it is an injury that we need to understand. So spondylolisthesis, so break the word down. So if we look at the spondylo, that basically refers to the spine and the vertebra. And then listhesis basically means that we have a slippage. So spondylolisthesis means that a vertebra slips forward in relation to the vertebra below it, as opposed to a retrolisthesis where it goes the other way. So when we address spondylolisthesis, just broad strokes here, so this doesn't turn into a 2-hour video clip. Basically, we need to look at there's 6 different types of spondylolisthesis depending upon the mechanic behind it. So that ranges from congenital, like you were born with some sort of disorder in the bones in that area. There's probably what you're referring to, which is an ischemic, which is the way that you've trained and done sport has caused a problem. So, for example, in young athletes, you might see gymnasts, cricket fast bowlers, martial arts practitioners, those sort of people. It's basically the idea of people that need to go from end ranges repeatedly very quickly. And it's a bit like if you take a credit card and you keep bending it one way, then bend it one way, then bend it one way, then it breaks. So what happens is we get a fracture in the pars bone, and it basically breaks away. So usually what happens is it starts off with a bit of like an ache, and you'll notice that when you're doing your sport or activity, it gets considerably worse. The less active you are, generally the more it starts to settle down. So that's usually an indication that you've got the fracture, but it hasn't potentially slipped yet. So the best thing at that point is to basically avoid the things that irritate it and give it a chance to settle down. And then once it's settled, we can carefully reintroduce those activities again, and the bone will start to heal, and it should heal that fracture so long as it hasn't started to slip. So you've already said that you've got the spondylolisthesis. So the listhesis means that it has started to slip. We've got a grade 1. So 6 different types, and there's 4 different grades depending on how far it's moved forward and out of alignment. So what we need to do is basically understand how severe it is. That might require a bit of investigation. So if you're lucky at the moment, you might not have lost any disc height, and you might not have any neural compression. It might literally just be that the fact that the bones kind of slicking apart is causing you pain and instability. What we need to be careful of is if you start to get into sort of radicular or neurological pain. So what I mean by that is when you do things like you say about lifting overhead and you irritate it, do you get just a general sensation of kind of irritation and grumpiness in the back? Or do you get very precise, almost like someone could take a pen and they could draw where it radiates down your leg, for example, because it's starting to hit a sciatic nerve. So when we've got very precise pain that can be the root of it can be very easily traced, it's very precise and very clear, then we know we've got a bit of an issue with radicular pain, like there's some neural compression going on. So we need to be careful of that, because that's probably going to need some sort of medical intervention to help with that. Could just be injections to relieve the inflammation around the root nerves, so that it sort of settles, so we can get back into a rehab plan. Or it may actually need some, serious surgery to kind of buttress that area, kind of bring it back into alignment and stop it from deteriorating any further. So we need to test and see if that's the case. So if you're doing those sort of aggravations and movements, we need to see what the pain response is like. That's going to tell you how far it's gone. And that is, of course, if it is an ischemic type of injury, which again is caused by your training and exercise. There are other types as well. We can have degenerative, usually it's because the facet joints kind of crumble as you get older. There could also be things related to certain diseases and things like that as well, or it could be trauma. Like you haven't said in your notes to me that you were involved in a car accident, so again I'm making massive assumptions here. It's not a trauma-based injury, because again that's going to be different. But what we need to do is just understand how severe it is by looking at giving you good provocation testing to see what movements and postures sensitize the back to pain, which movements and postures help, and how severe it is when we do get provocation. Is it a ridiculous type of pain? Because we're going to probably need some medical intervention to help us manage that for sure. It could be something it could be something conservative like a injection to help manage the pain and the compression around the nerve, or it might need something a bit more serious, but we need a bit more investigation. Once it's turned to a spondylolisthesis and the bone's starting to break away and it's starting to slip away, it's a little bit different. When it's just a pure sort of spondy, and you've just got the fracture, that's a little bit easier to deal with, especially in sort of younger athletes and younger people, because you can give it a chance to heal. But yeah, so if you're lifting overhead, basically you're going to create a bit of a shear force into extension. So you probably find that you drive a lot of overhead. When you're doing overhead pressing, you drive extension with your lower back, not with your hips. So again, you'd have to test for this, but I'm going to assume that your glute control over hip extension is pretty bad as well. So if it wasn't too bad, we didn't do medical intervention, what we would be looking at is, teach you to brace properly, stop you slipping into excessive extension, and learn to control your glutes a lot more. So when you drive extension, it comes from your hips, and we're not trying to sort of crank and extend through a lower spine and put that load for that one joint. But again, we've got to test to see how severe it is. Because again, if it is gotten past a certain threshold, we're going to need a little bit of medical intervention to help. So that's the general idea. So again, I'm going to assume it's ischemic. So there might have been stuff when you throughout your training or your sport history that's created that problem for you. So basically, the simple idea is if those things have created it, we need to remove those things, let things start to settle down, look at your particular muscular weaknesses and imbalance, fix those up, and then we can gradually reintroduce the things that you want to do and see whether you're going to have a long-term tolerance to them or not. So, question from Dan. What does the Q brace actually mean? Breathe in and hold, tense the core. So basically when we say bracing, we call it abdominal brace, but really if you're talking about what you want to focus on, there's two the way I approach it, there's two different types. So there's my kind of initial brace, which you can sort of generally use for most day-to-day activities when you're kind of recovering from back injuries. This is the sort of thing you would do getting out of a car, getting down to the floor, getting out of a chair, whatever it may be. Those sort of general movements, we're not trying to lift heavy, awkward things. And that's basically just tensing the obliques here. So when we find your belly button, if you trace out roughly 5 or 6 inches, stab ourselves with our fingers into our obliques, and then fight our fingers with those muscles. But as you can tell, mine are on, I'm still talking to you. So I'm using those obliques separate to what the diaphragm is up to. So that kind of gives us like our sort of our first level of brace. That's the first skill in a practice. And that's basically what you're working on. When you do things like a McGill curl, for example, or a plank, or some sort of plank variation, front plank variation, that's the skill that you're trying to develop. And the way that I look at it is the more that you can consciously contract it in something like a McGill curl, the more it starts to come in of its own accord subconsciously when you're doing things day to day for other people. But you need to be careful, because some people, when you teach them to brace, if they've got compression sensitive damage like end plate fractures, for example, they'll feel worse if you put them into a brace, not better. So again, that's why provocation testing at the start lets us know what the rules of the game are, what are the exercises we can and can't do. So that's your level 1, is just that general brace, but you can still breathe. And imagine like a dial of 1 to sort of 10. We can dial it up and dial it down based on what we're doing. And the idea is that when we use that brace, we use what we need for the given task, or if we're doing an exercise, we basically get it as much as we can without it leaking into our back. So if you're doing McGill curl and we're getting back pain, there's a bit of a leakage there in the signal, so he's got to take it down a couple of notches, work on what he can with perfect technique, not let it leak out. Otherwise we're going to ingrain our bracing problems, not fix them. So again, that's kind of a level 1, so it's bracing those obliques and to breathe. Now, second stage is a lot more involved, and that's the sort of technique you're going to see for people who do, especially things like powerlifters and strongmen. That's when they lock in that brace, they take a little bit of air in, and then compress their ribs and kind of drive into it. So a good person to look at for understanding the technique is a guy called Chris Duffin. He's really good at explaining how to do it. But the idea that way I look at it is I brace, I breathe into that brace a little bit, and then like an air piston, I almost compress everything down. So you sort of know, if you've got it right, you'll brace, and everything sort of locks back down again. So the ribs kind of lock down just a little bit. A mistake a lot of people make when they make a brace is they breathe into it and go, and then they kind of open their ribs and create what we call like an open scissor, and actually just loading your back and not really getting much out of this kind of core on this brace. What we want to do is brace and lock down into it. You know when you got it right when you do things like deadlifts and squats, you basically feel, it almost feels like you're lifting the weight with the brace. It's kind of a hard thing to explain sometimes, but you just feel super solid, and you know you're in control of the weight, and there's no way it's going to slip into your back and start causing you problems. But it is a skill we need to practice, and it's just something you've got to keep work on. You've got to keep it sharp, so the stronger you get, the sharper it needs to be to stop you from cranking your back as those weights and those loads get heavier. But for now, just think of two types. The basic one is tensing your obliques, but you can still breathe, like mine's on now and I'm talking to you. And then there's the kind of the more advanced version when things get heavier and more awkward. We brace and lock into it. And generally you do sort of single reps with that. Although having said that, I've seen people like Sebastian Oreb that will lock it in and he'll do like 12 reps on the bench press on a single breath, just so he doesn't lose position. So again, it basically you just need to sort of tune it. Once you understand the basic mechanics, just tune it to what works for you and what your training and lifting goals are. And sort of fine tune it. But that's a general idea, is you've got sort of two different types. There's a kind of a mid-level moderate, just using your obliques, and then when we need to get really serious, we can lock the diaphragm on top, and obviously that sends your blood pressure through the roof and you can't breathe, so you're going to be able to hold it for a very finite amount of time before you start to feel like you're going to pass out. So again, skill to work on, but that's what we mean is tensing your obliques. So don't think about necessarily pushing your belly out, definitely don't think about sucking things in that's going to make you weaker. We just lock everything together. So you're basically locking those ribs into your hips and your pelvis, and you feel like one big solid unit. Okay, last question. Andre, could you please show in a video which way is the best way to put on socks without triggering your pain aggravators if you have limited hip mobility? So basically you've got a couple choices for this. One is obviously being sat down and then just hooking your leg over and then being able to put your shoes and socks on that way. There is another way that I used to do it when my back was absolutely toast. That's called the baby method. So we'll just switch to that now. So the baby method, this is what I used to use when my back was absolutely in pieces, is I'd get myself carefully down to the floor, roll onto my back, and I'd be here. So I could just hook my leg over, I could put my socks on here, and down, and obviously change to the side, socks and shoes on. Then I'd very carefully roll to my front and then use my lunge straight to get off of the floor. The reason why this worked for me is that every time I moved into a bit too much flexion, especially lateral flexion, I get a massive catch, I get like a jolt of pain. And the idea was here that being on my back, I've got very limited flexion that I can slip into because of what the floor is stopping me from losing too much control. But also there's very limited compression on my spine as well, because I was very compression flexion sensitive. So for me, being in this position, although I still had to deal with a bit of awkwardness with the tightness of my hips, at least there was no danger. I've taken away a lot of the potential danger from compressed flexion. And also if I do get a jolt of pain, I'm not going to fall on the floor, because I'm already on the floor. So I'm here. So there's no sort of danger. And then when I'm ready, I can just very carefully come down. I can roll over to the side onto my front and then carefully stand up. So again, this is my sort of go-to when my back was absolutely in pieces. Just again, sort of limited the potential damage by removing a lot of the problem with compressed flexion. But again, find what works best for you. So some people sit in the chair and just doing sort of hooking the leg up if they can do. But if not, doing this works quite well. If you're super limited with hip mobility, you can sort of drag your leg on and then use the other one to kind of help you get up there a little bit, and then hook your foot on, hook your sock on. So again, this is my sort of go-to if people with really bad backs, to use like a baby method. And you could do it on the bed as well if you wanted to. It's probably a little bit trickier, but my favourite is to do it on the floor, because hey, if you're on the floor, you can't fall down to the floor if you get a jolt of pain, so at least you're already there.